Well, it was really nice of you all to give me that round of applause, but I think you should also greet our guests, Lawrence and Richard. They're here too. They may not be as famous as I am, but I think they still deserve your
We're
respect
nervous
and
about
welcome.
being here with you.
All right, so let's dive in. I'm hoping that at some point in what's going to be a free-ranging, freewheeling discussion of science and reason that we'll get to some things that you two might not see eye to eye about. But let's start out with something that I think you are on the same page about, and I have some questions about it. So one thing that I think is really apparent in the movie The Unbelievers, and also in your speeches and your writings, is this emotional reaction that you both have to science. The awe and the joy that you feel when you talk about scientific discovery and the scientific method and the scientific mindset is quite apparent. And I think that's interesting because it's not actually the default reaction that most people have. You know, when people learn about the heat death of the universe or the fact that our life, our species' existence was something of an accident, and that there's no built-in purpose or meaning to life, often the reaction is less on excitement and more, depression. So my first question is, I'm curious why you think you have this sort of positive reaction to the scientific view of the universe and human life.
It's not, but it's the reaction we beat out of kids. All kids start out with that positive reaction to the universe. It's a joy in learning. We're hardwired to want to learn and solve puzzles, and what happens is that gets beaten out of people, I think, by teachers. And so I don't think I think we are told that science is hard or boring, and that we see that sometimes in role models, and instead, I think everyone, look at the people in this audience, everyone really is excited by science. They don't know what science they're excited by. They're told it's so difficult that they can't enjoy it. And yet, we became scientists because we enjoyed it, right? That's why you became.
Yes, and the fact of your existence is the most astonishing fact. The fact that you're capable of apprehending the world, the fact that you're capable of doing all the mundane things that you were talking about, Julia, about how the normal reaction is just not to be particularly excited. It is astounding that we have in our heads machinery, computational machinery, which is capable of understanding why we're here, and a long way towards understanding why the universe is here and why the world is here. How could anybody not be absolutely riveted by the privilege that we enjoy of being placed in a world that we understand? For 4 billion years, life has been evolving, and finally now, just in the last few thousand years, a species has arisen which has a brain capable of understanding what it's all about. And we are it. How could you not be completely blown away by that astonishing discovery? How could anyone actually admit without shame to being bored?
It's really a shame, though. Absolutely. That's right. I think that, unfortunately, and I don't know if it's the case in Belgium, but it's in my country, it's certainly the case that it's a badge of honor to be considered to be scientifically illiterate. It's something, not only is it acceptable, but it's kind of a cultural badge of honor when you say, well, I don't really understand that stuff. And we let people get away with it. It wasn't always that way. Shame on them, and it used to be 100 years ago that they would be laughed out of the room if they didn't at least have a cocktail party knowledge of science while they talk about those other things. And again, the heat death of the universe, how could anyone not be thrilled by that?
I don't know what to say. The scientific worldview I was talking about was less scientific discovery in general and more the truly daunting scale of the universe and our relative insignificance in it.
Makes you feel humble, is what
it makes you feel humble, but it makes you feel, as Richard said, it should have the opposite effect. religion supposedly makes you feel good because you're the center of the universe, which is just silly. The fact that we are not the center of the universe, that we are insignificant, as I think I said in the movie, in some sense, makes you feel more special. It's just such a fortunate accident that we're here, and we can watch the whole thing happen. To me, it seems to me, our insignificance should breed more awe than this ridiculous notion that there's some divine being that cares about us.
Mm.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have seen this movie Annie Hall, but it's a Woody Allen movie. And in the beginning, young 7-year-old Woody Allen has just learned about entropy, and now he's refusing to do his homework because none of it matters. And it is played for laughs, but I certainly know people who, they're fine now, but when they were kids or adolescents and they learned about entropy or...
Is that the place where somebody says, Brooklyn is not expanding?
Yeah. Father. Eat your... Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm talking more about the sort of dizzying realization that there is no built-in meaning or set of values in the universe, that there's no
you've got to have courage to face that.
Yeah, I'm asking really about that. And
you're asking about that.
You guys have always had this strength of
I think everyone... But, I think, like a lot of things, people pretend they're driven by that meaning that someone else imposes on them. But ultimately, the meaning you give your own actions, even for the religious people, I think, matters more. Ultimately, and that's what we need to teach people, is that the only meaning is the meaning you give it, and becomes more precious when you choose what matters than when someone else chooses what matters for you. It's the pleasure of growing up. When you're a child, other people choose what matters for you. But the thrill of growing up is to choose for yourself. And a lot of people just haven't grown up yet.
But how do you know if you're choosing right, though?
Well, you don't know until you... But that's the thrill of being alive, is not knowing if you chose right. If you knew it would be boring. The possibility of making mistakes. And as a physicist, I do that professionally. And it's a lot of fun.
How much does that pay?
There is, I suppose, a certain fear of the cold unknown. The universe almost entirely empty. This is a little oasis of life. There may be others, but I think that's exhilarating. I think the thought that you're looking out at a cold, dark, empty universe, and here we have this oasis of light and understanding and warmth, and human affection and all the things that make life worth living, and the purposes that, as Laurel says, the purposes we make for ourselves. There's something false about taking comfort in the face of that from an illusion. And it's better to stand up tall and courageous and face the empty universe and make your own purposes.
But Richard, when I know we've talked about this, it's not just empty. I mean, we get awe, both of us, and I imagine most people in the audience, by looking up at the sky and seeing this vast, not just emptiness, but it's full of amazing things. The Hubble Space Telescope pictures are universally loved because people are amazed by the stuff that's out there. And the fact that it's so immense, it indeed confirms their insignificance, but I think it breeds a kind of awe and spiritual wonder that's far, as I often say, is far preferable to the spirituality of religion because it's actually true. So,
and it's big. It's not petty and small. And yes.
And exactly. Yeah. You don't have to pray to it 5 times a day.
Yeah.
This is a slight tangent, but I'm wondering if either of you are worried by the apparent emptiness of the universe in terms of what that might mean for whether our civilization has a good chance of progressing technologically enough to make it out into the stars. So this is the Fermi paradox. Some of you may be familiar with.
Where is everybody?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So where is everybody? And if other civilizations have not made it to the point where they progressed enough to send out
the main reason for thinking there might be other civilizations is the statistical one, that the universe is so huge and the number of available planets is so huge. But by the same token, it's so big and so spaced out that it would be entirely plausible that there might be as few as 1 billion other civilizations out there. As few as 1 billion. Because if it's as few as 1 billion, it's going to be so spaced out that we wouldn't expect to hear from them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's becoming, I just wrote a piece, it's becoming, I think, I'm more optimistic that there's life in the universe. Every day we learn about new planets, the new solar systems that we didn't think were possible. Literally, we thought violated the laws of physics exist, and we find out we have to rethink that. And we've learned over the last 40 years that life exists in these environments, which we also thought were impossible. So life is incredibly robust, and so the likelihood of life in the universe is very great. But the fact that we haven't seen life is, if you think about it, it's virtually impossible to find it if it's out there. It's very difficult. If you, as I often say, our sun is only 4.5 billion years old, and our universe is 13.8 billion years old. And so there could be civilizations that survive, that have been around for billions of years. I frankly think intelligent civilizations don't survive that long, but let's say they are. They could have looked at the Earth since its formation 4.5 billion years ago. If someone told them exactly where to look and said, look at that third rock from the sun, right over there, then even then they would have almost never found life on Earth, because only during the last 50 to 75 years could they have listened to Star Trek or whatever. Would our signals go out? So 50 years over 4.5 billion, you're talking of a chance of less than 1 in 500 million almost of finding life even on Earth if you knew exactly where to look. And we don't know where to look, and we don't even know what channel to tune to. So it's hard. That's
actually a little depressing, because it makes it sound like only a small minority of a civilization's entire history is spent in a technologically advanced age, which makes it sound like we're due to be ended soon.
Well, I actually have written a paper about that a bunch of years ago. It turns out, it's a little I'll give you 30 seconds of it. It's an amazing fact that our civilization right now works on Moore's law, so that this has more computing power than the Apollo spacecraft did by far. So every year or so, the computing power of systems doubles, and that's something called Moore's law, and it's been working for 40 years or so. But if you work out, it turns out to take energy to do a computation, or at least erase the registers. And we worked out that if Moore's law, if it continued for 250 years, doing computations and improving at that rate, you'd use up the entire energy of the galaxy, okay, in 250 years. So it's clear that advanced civilizations can't continue as ours has. And I think that's profound. To me, that was rather profound. It means at some point they level off, and I ultimately think the solution to the Fermi paradox is that at some point they decide they don't need to talk to us. I mean, ultimately they turn inward and they say,
we go out talking to pigs?
we know we have nothing to learn, and so we'll just hang around here and stare at our navels or something like that. Anyway.
I'd love to return for a minute to the shift that happens when you replace a religious worldview with a secular scientific worldview. So I was asking before about this sort of sense of meaning that some people feel that they lose with that shift. But I'm also interested in morality and values, and whether, yes, granted, I know both of you believe that religion is not a particularly good source of a moral system. I believe the word Richard has used is horrible.
That was kind.
That was he was in a good mood that day.
Yeah.
But is there anything that you think can be justified in replacing religion as a source of morality,
I think
other than our own sort of...
I think we have to make our morality by intelligent design.
Are you taking back that term?
Taking back that term. We certainly are not going to get any help from religion. God forbid we should get any moral help, either from Scripture, which has a truly appalling moral lesson to teach, or from just the sort of naive being good because you're scared of God, being good because you're scared you'll go to hell. That's, again, a very immoral way to get your morality. So we have to sit down together and design our own morality, which is what moral philosophers do. We have to sit down and decide what kind of society we want to live in, what kind of rules we need to live by. Things, I mean, expansions of the golden rule, do as it would be done by. Make our morality fit our society in an intelligently designed way. And moral philosophers are doing a pretty good job of that. And I derive encouragement from the fact that as you look at history, there's a really rather rapid improvement in our moral standards. We're moving towards, moving away from slavery, moving away from various forms of appalling cruelty, not over the whole of the world, but over large parts of the world.
And do you think that's roughly inevitable?
I don't know what it's a bit like Moore's law, which is true, but nobody knows quite why. If you look back to not that long ago, if you just look back a few decades and listen to transport yourself in a time machine back to a typical dinner party 100 years ago, and you would be hearing racism, you'd be hearing sexism, women wouldn't have the vote, there would be, you'd be utterly appalled by the sorts of things that people were saying. Decade by decade by decade, we're getting better. And I don't know what that is. It is like Moore's law, which is an empirically demonstrable phenomenon, but nobody quite knows what's driving it, and especially why it goes exponential.
Right. And the mechanism changes every decade or so.
As you know, our friend Steve Pinker's written a wonderful book on the better angels of our nature, and I think in there, implicit in that book, is the argument that rationality and the Enlightenment had a huge amount to do with it, because you learn that the individuals who were slaves are the same as you. You learn empirical facts that increase empathy at some level, that pain, that animals experience pain, and you learn. So I think that, and you learn that that women are actually equal, and or if you're married, you learn they're superior. But and by the way, speaking of that, I have to say one thing I disagree with you that I learned from my wife, who I see over there, that the golden rule is not a good rule. It's if you think about it, do unto others as you would have them do unto you is not the right thing. You should do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And it's a really different thing, because the example I can think of is, let's say, well, I guess it's Belgium, I can say this. Let's say, you like to be spanked, okay?
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, well, exactly. But if that's how let's say I wanted to be spanked, you wouldn't want me to treat you as I would.
Indeed, I wouldn't.
Exactly.
No.
Okay.
We got here a lot faster than I expected we would. Just so you know.
Okay.
I mean, I think if you generalize the golden rule, it completely
Yeah,
works.
I did say generalized golden rule.
Yeah, generalized version.
Like I might want you to give me chocolate ice cream, and if your favorite flavor is vanilla, then the rule is not I should give you chocolate, but I should give you the flavor of ice cream you like best.
Yeah.
But
that's
how I would save the golden rule.
But the other thing that I think is well, obviously we both agree that we don't, and I don't think most people get their morality from the Bible anyway. The only ones who do are the ones who are full of hate, frankly. I think most of us get our morality from reason. And I asked in the movie, there's a scene where I was speaking to a Islamic audience, and I asked, would you kill your neighbor if you'd stop believing God? And I was shocked. It's the only time I saw people with their hands up. But I don't really think they would. I think most people act the way they do because of rational ideas about what kind of society they would want to live in. Moreover, I think we do everyone a disservice by saying loss of faith as if there's something lost. I think we got to replace that word. When we say lose faith, it makes it seem like there's an emptiness inside of you, but there isn't.
A faith-shaped hole.
You gain much more than you lose, and you don't lose anything. And so I think we should work on the language a little bit.
I think it comes ultimately from rationality, but it's kind of filtered through the sort of social engines of conversation and journalism and parliamentary discussions and
it being morality?
Jurisprudence, yes. It comes ultimately from rationality, but things like attitudes to non-human animals, attitudes to children, attitudes to women, these are in the air. There's a climate of opinion which is sort of, it's not literally hovering over the top of us like a ghost, but it's in the air in the sense that it's part of the culture. I mean, the decline of sexism, for example, which is dramatic. The way we treat homosexuals, dramatic change. gay marriage is now accepted and commonplace, and it's not that long ago, 1960s, it was illegal in Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, you could be sent to prison for homosexual activities.
And you were.
And you were. There's a shift in this zeitgeist, this ghost that's hovering around in the culture, and it's interesting to project where it's going to go next. I think
it's pretty hard to know, of course, but it gives one hope. I've just written a piece I hope will come out next week in the New York Times, but that will. People say, and maybe this is one of your questions, I don't want to usurp it, but in fact, a journalist was just asking us today, do you think religion will ever go away? It's hard to know, but it's amazing how much can be done in a generation. There's a statement that, theories never die, but physicists die, and so that's how physics progresses, because the old guys die and you move on. And I think the same is true. You're always only one generation away. And the example that Richard brought up is, I think, a really good one. In my country, again, gay marriage would have been, even a decade ago, would have been inconceivable. But if you look at any kid in the United States under 30, but even under 20, and I think mostly throughout the rest of the world, they don't even understand what the issue is. So it's the children. If we can just have one generation of children who are enlightened, then it goes away. And part of what I think we're trying to do is encourage children to question. And once they do, I think even religion can go away.
Well, that is actually a great segue into something I wanted to ask you both about, which is I certainly share your impression or conviction that removing religion from the world would have a bunch of good effects. That said, there's some interesting research pointing in the other direction, maybe not wholly, but at least a couple entries in the con column that are worth noting. So there have been a number of meta-analyses looking at dozens of studies, looking for just correlations between degree of religiosity measured by various things like belief in God or attendance at church, and various aspects of pro-social behavior. So sometimes that's stated compassion for others, sometimes it's number of altruistic acts or degree of empathy, cooperativeness, all the sorts of things that we think of as being valuable for society to run well and lead to human flourishing. So I'm wondering...
Well, look, there's one thing as a physicist that I really got to point out, and I worry about this when people do epidemiological studies and social studies. There's a difference between correlation and causation.
Sure.
So the question is, where's the chicken egg? Are the people who are somehow more charitable and more cooperative, somehow because in our society religion is an outlet, they explore, or is it, and I think that's just as likely as the other way around.
I absolutely agree. This is not a proof at all. But imagine if it were switched. Imagine if the evidence showed that religious people were more antisocial. Surely we would be holding that up as evidence, right?
I'll hold you up one. In my country, those states, the red states, which are the ones where there's much more fundamentalism. As you probably know, the incidence of, in fact, unwanted children, the incidence of violent crime, those are much higher in those states. Almost all of those negative characteristics are, and so I guess you can choose what study you pick, but it's rather interesting that those states that tout their religious morality the greatest tend to produce the most immorality.
That's a fairly strong effect. I mean, that's the work of Gregory Paul, who did it not only on the states within the United States, he did it in countries of Europe as well, and I mean, comparing, for example, the Scandinavian countries where there's great social welfare and everything is kind of cushy, and the least religious countries in Europe. It is a very strong effect. I haven't seen the meta-analysis you're talking about, Julia.
But I think look. But at the same time, to defend you in some sense in that statement, there's no doubt that I don't think either of us would argue that religion provides certain things for many people: a sense of community, in some cases, a sense of a motivation to charity and goodwill, at least at Christmas. But I think so. That's fine. But the question is it necessary? Could you find other better outlets? Could you find ones that are more real that might induce less violence. And so religion wouldn't have been around in every society that's ever existed if it didn't have some effect that was at least positive in the sense of self-perpetuating.
Right.
But to me, the question is, fine, what are the things that it does provide, and can we find better outlets for that? I would prefer every Sunday, instead of going to church because the reason people go to church every Sunday, I think, is that the stories are so ridiculous that they have to be reinforced every single Sunday. So anyway. I've said quantum mechanics classes every Sunday would be so much better than don't you think?
We could sing songs about quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
So I think we can't let this topic close without pointing out the totally obvious fact that it wouldn't matter if there was an absolutely cast iron case that religion makes you better. It doesn't make it true.
Yeah, that's right.
And as a scientist, that's the important point. I mean, truth has got to come first, and if there are moral benefits as well, so much the better.
So that is actually another thing I was wondering, whether this, the importance of getting rid of false beliefs in the case of religion, whether or not they're helpful or harmful, is something you would generalize overall, that all false beliefs in all domains, whether it's beliefs about my own, we all likability or about...
Yeah, and I think you've heard me say we all tend, except for Richard, most of us tend to believe 10 impossible things before breakfast in order to get up. As you like your job or whatever. But I think the problem is that false beliefs produce irrational behavior. And if you were an island and you didn't impact on other people, I wouldn't give a damn about it. But those false beliefs produce irrational behavior, and you have one way or another control over others. If you're a parent, you have control over your children. A teacher, in some sense, you impact, or a politician. And we see what happens when you have irrational behavior. We can look. I mean, look what it's just clear that irrational behavior is ultimately negative, and so. I think on the whole, you might say, is it better to just let people be, ignorant of bliss or believe their false beliefs and feel happy? And I don't think either of us wants to make anyone unhappy. The question is, ultimately, if when they go out in the world and those false beliefs suddenly collide with reality, there's a great potential for unhappiness. And that's my concern. And in fact, not only happiness for you, but the people you impact with.
It's a little weird for me to be arguing on this side of the debate, because so often I'm arguing for the importance of unrooting and challenging your false beliefs. But still, there's this element in the con column that troubles me a little bit, which is in at least a sizable minority of cases, there's a false belief that is clearly providing a benefit. Like it is giving me comfort to believe that that job that I lost, that was actually for the best that I lost it because of XYZ, or that girl who dumped me, she snored anyway, so actually I'm better off. And I can see a clear benefit since in those cases I'm assuming there's nothing you can do to change the situation for which it would be helpful to be able to face the truth. And I can it's hard for me to point to a clear benefit of trying to get people or encouraging people to face...
It's funny, I'm going to be a devil's advocate because I often say, we all rationalize...
I've lost track of what sides we're on, but...
It helps us get through life, but maybe if you realize that she dumped you because you snored, you should work on it because the next one will too.
Oh no, this imaginary girlfriend
Yeah, I
snored.
know, but I'm just saying, sometimes accepting reality makes you better for the next time around. It may be painful now, but it's tough love.
So you're not accepting my premise that there are some situations where you can't do anything with the painful
I think
truth.
that there is something quite an interesting thought that we might have evolved to be a little bit more optimistic than reality would allow.
Yeah.
And there's experimental evidence from psychologists that everybody, not everybody, but the majority of people think they're more good-looking than they are, cleverer than they are.
And all the children are above average.
And better drivers. Goodness knows people think that. Better drivers than
they are. Except depressed people who have a realistic view of
they have
the
a realistic view.
This is true.
You could make a kind of Darwinian case that you survive better in life if your view of life is a little bit rose-tinted spectacles. But I wouldn't drag religion into that. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea that there's a selective advantage to thinking that the glass is half full rather than half empty.
But the point, that's a good example. It's good to be optimistic, unless your optimism ultimately will have you collide with reality and produce unhappiness. So there's a careful balance.
It's only a slight edge.
And I mean the glass, if it's half full or half empty, it's your choice to call it with. But a half full glass isn't full, and to imagine it is going to ultimately cause you problems.
I think to play devil's advocate to my own devil's advocate, you could make the case that being in the habit of sort of practicing doublethink and trying to decide, well, should I fool myself in this case, or is there a benefit to me to trying to ignore the truth in this case is harmful to your overall ability to seek the truth?
Well, look, the other thing is there's a huge amount of evidence. As I keep saying, we have a rational side, but we are not just rational animals. And I think there's a lot of evidence now of studies that show that even when we make rational decisions, reason doesn't necessarily rule over passion. That in fact our brain is that there are emotional reasons that we end up making the rational decision to justify the decision we wanted to do. And I think we have to recognize we all do that as human beings, and just get on with it.
Do you see the potential for any kind of second enlightenment where we actually improve our ability to be rational?
Well, science, I think science is a huge part of that, right? I mean, science, the major benefit of science is to second guess yourself. I mean, that's what science teaches us, is that A, that it's okay to be wrong, and B, that you often want something, and therefore you convince yourself of something that isn't true. And when we produce science, we get used to asking, is this really happening, or is it we want it to happen? And that's one of the reasons why I think it's such an important thing to try and convey to people. Mm-hmm. Not just the facts of the amazing universe, but the process of opening your mind up to the possibility that you're wrong. And that's, to me, one of the greatest benefits of science.
It is true that science has its own built-in discipline, its own built-in police system, really, to make sure you're not deceiving yourself. Mm-hmm. And this is fairly recent, I think. I mean, medical researchers now are scrupulous about doing double-blind trials because we've realized that it's so easy to want a particular result so much that you, totally innocently, without meaning to, you bias your observations, you bias all sorts of things. It's got to be done in a blind way, and this is all part of the self-policing that science imposes, which I think nothing else really does.
Yeah, and it's still, as a scientist, you constantly have to train yourself, and there's in experimental science, there's many examples of people finding we all want to believe. We all, as Fox Mulder would say in the X-Files, we all want to believe, and I think it's really important to realize that. And Richard Feynman, who is someone who is a physicist, of course, is a hero, and I wrote a book about him. But he used to try and reinforce that all the time by going around to people and saying, "You won't believe what happened to me today. You just won't believe what happened to me today."
What?
And people say, "What?" And he'd say, "Absolutely nothing." and because we all assume significance to things that are completely accidental and not significant. And the greatest example is dreams. People dream nonsense dreams most of their lives, but one day they have a dream that happens to, their friend breaks their leg, and then they wake up the next day and their friend breaks their arm, and they go, cosmic, and anyway.
But so you're describing mechanisms in science that keep science not completely honest, but honester than it could be or honester than it was. And I think, unfortunately, the human brain is just really good at compartmentalizing, and a scientist who's very scrupulous about randomization and blinding and not mining data in the lab will come home and cherry pick examples of when his wife didn't do the dishes and ignore the cases when he didn't do the dishes, etc. So I'd be curious if you guys have any, if you find yourself using any of these principles of scientific thinking and objectivity in your regular lives, when you're not doing science. Maybe you could share with us.
Well, there are many examples of the opposite. I mean, scientists, believe it or not, are human, and And
Good thing I was sitting down for
yeah,
that one,
yeah.
Lawrence.
No, it's a surprise to many people. And so, of course, I like to think that that I'm more able to try and second guess what I'm doing. But I'm fully aware that, like anyone else, I do exactly that. You feel better, and it's easy to want to do the things that make you feel better. But
and it's sort of interesting, isn't it, that somebody who is too clinically scientific in their personal life, people don't like them very much. I mean, who's the character in Star Trek who has no emotion?
Spock.
Spock?
Yeah, Spock.
He's not human, so it's okay.
Yes,
That is
but sometimes real humans are compared to Spock.
You know, it's funny because all my favorite characters in Star Trek are always the ones who like Data and Spock, the non-emotional.
I've never actually seen Star Trek. So
I know. Don't tell him.
I hope no one brought Rotten Tomatoes
I keep telling
to
Richard
throw
he
you.
shouldn't admit his cultural.
Yeah.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay.
Have you guys heard of the straw Vulcan? It's an archetype. It's a play on the straw man, which is like a weakened caricature of an argument, and the straw Vulcan is a weakened caricature of rationality or science.
Oh, okay.
So the straw Vulcan is the one going around, sniffing at people for falling in love or appreciating beauty or having fun.
But that's unfortunately though that's a stereotype. Again, I think it's really important that we convey scientists as people, and sometimes sexy people, and I work on no anyway. But I think it's really important, and I was on once on the Sundance. There's a festival called the Sundance Film Festival, and I was a judge there one year because there's a competition of trying to not have movies about science, but have movies with scientists in them, because scientists are indeed stereotyped as being non-emotional, non-romantic, none of the rest. And I don't even mind, as many of my colleagues hate, but I don't even mind The Big Bang Theory. I happen to like it. And I've been there and at the set of it. And because I think those characters are even though they are stereotypes, in some ways they actually are very likable and emotional. And as you come to know them over time, you find out that they're likable. And so whether or not, and it's important that we convey all aspects of science instead of the stereotype white jacket, non-emotional scientist, because science is full of emotion. Now, the results of science aren't full of emotion, but the practice of science is full of emotion for both of us and all scientists. Scientists become scientists because it's fun, or they enjoy it at least. They certainly wouldn't do it if they didn't. There's a great deal of emotion in it. See? Richard agrees with me, see?
One excellent argument undermined in a single.
Yeah. No, he agrees with me.
No, I agree totally.
Yeah, there we go.
Totally and utterly. Yeah.
Well, there's a scene in the movie where Richard says it, but Carl Sagan, in that.
When you're in love, you want to tell the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
When you're in
said,
love, you want to
He's in
tell the
love
world. If you're in love with science,
Right.
how
Yeah.
could you not, or something like that?
Yeah.
Well, sort of relatedly, one of my I feel like I'm only just bringing up concerns about science and reason, but just know that I'm 99% on its side.
You've been asked to be devil's advocate.
Yeah, just know that,
right.
please. So I have a friend who refers to skepticism as sort of the community of skeptics as being subject to something he calls the cowpox of doubt. And basically the idea is that as a skeptic, and I would imagine as an advocate for atheism, you spend so much time going around pointing out ridiculous false beliefs that other people have, that can, he was hypothesizing, kind of inoculate you against noticing your own false beliefs, because you get used to thinking of false beliefs as these obviously ridiculous things.
Well,
and of course, you don't see any obvious ridiculous things in your own belief set.
Well, first of all, in Richard's defense, I don't think, in spite of what the press say, I think if you look at what we both talk about, and Richard, look at the books that we were signing today. We spend much more time talking about the wonder of reality than trying to find out false beliefs. Of course, talking about the wonder of reality point inevitably shows those false beliefs are wrong, but I don't even think you are would you call yourself an advocate for atheism, or would you just call yourself an advocate for reality?
Yeah, reality. That's
Yeah,
what I'm saying.
I think
but I'm I don't think we picked up on the cowpox point, but which I didn't quite get. I mean, the thing about cowpox is that it immunizes you against smallpox.
Right.
And so what your friend is saying is that we are
immune to
because we're so used to talking about ridiculous things like homeopathy and religion. We are therefore somehow blinded to the smallpox, which is. I wonder what he's thinking of as being.
Well, so
even
smallpox.
Your own beliefs. He's saying your own beliefs. You're not willing to question them because you. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah. So you get used to always being on the clear side of correct beliefs, and you don't spend as much time wondering if what you believe is actually true.
I'm struggling to make the analogy into a good one.
I'll pass that on.
No, but I think there's another reason that we are inoculated because we happen to have a public voice, both of us. Mm-hmm. It's really easy to find out when you're wrong because you just have to say something and you get a gazillion tweets, and so there's a lot of feedback, and in fact you have to be very. I've learned, and I assume you've learned, that you can say things off the cuff when you're in a dinner party. But when you're in public, or if you write it in a book, you have to be much more careful because people will immediately jump on it, and that's a good thing, I think. But so I think that helps has helped me be very. I actually sometimes hold my tongue. It may not seem like it, but to think about. Yeah, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? Anyway.
Do you find it at all difficult to acknowledge when you got something wrong, or when some?
I love being. Well, I often say, as a physicist, that the best situation to be in if you're a physicist is wrong or confused, and I'm both all the time. I just think it's the best thing in the world. That's great because being wrong means you've learned something. There's something new about the world, and being confused means also there's something to learn. So, yeah, I have no problem being wrong, or in particular, more important, and I think this is the problem that parents and teachers have. I have no problem not knowing. And I think more parents and more teachers should say, I don't know, and because that's the impression that kids get is that everything is known is a good reason for them not to want to learn anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
See, Richard's very talkative. Okay.
Well, I've told anecdotes about two teachers of mine, which I've printed them, so I probably won't repeat them. And one of them. Saying I don't know in a very. Have everybody heard this anecdote, or shall I
tell it?
Okay, I'll tell it, and I apologise to people who've read it. We were having a biology lesson at school, and we were talking about Hydra, which is a little freshwater creature, and our teacher, Mr. Thomas, said, "What animal eats Hydra?" And he pointed to the first boy. What animal eats Hydra? And the boy guessed, and then the next one, what animal eats Hydra? He went all the way around. No, what animal eats Hydra? And went all the way around, and then he got us all eager to know. So we were all going, sir, what animal does eat Hydra? And then he stopped, and was dead silence, and then he said, I don't know. I don't know. And I don't think Mr. Coulson knows either. Mr. Coulson! And he rushed into the next door room, opened the door, dragged his senior colleague out, who was looking a bit bewildered. Mr. Coulson, do you know what animal eats Hydra? And Mr. Coulson fortunately had the sense to say, I don't know. Yeah. We none of us have forgotten that lesson, that you say I don't know, and it's a virtue because then you want to find out. And the other anecdote, which I've also published, is of a sort of elder statesman figure in the Department of Zoology at Oxford, John R. Baker, who had spent much of his life propounding his theory that the so-called Golgi apparatus, which is in all cells, was actually an artifact. It wasn't really there. And finally, a visiting researcher came from America and gave a research talk in the department, showing lots of slides, proving beyond any doubt that the Golgi apparatus is real, it's not an artifact. And John Baker stood up, marched to the front, shook his hand and said, my dear fellow, I wish to thank you. I've been wrong these 15 years. And that aroused the most tremendous cheer from the audience. Whereas in a political context, being wrong is not, you try not to admit it. If you're wrong, the opposition shout, resign, resign, and things like that.
That was cool.
So in science, it's okay not to know, and it's okay to be wrong. At least we pay lip service to that. In practice, sometimes if you have indeed spent your whole life propounding something, you were quoting Max Planck earlier, Lawrence, science proceeds funeral by funeral. I mean, that's the negative.
Yeah,
deal.
no, it's very hard, but I think it's what we should be teaching. Look, and I think I said in the movie that really, in physics anyway, the only way people learn is by confronting their own misconceptions. You can tell them something, but it's not the same as if they see for themselves that they were wrong. That's one of the reasons why you often use science fiction in teaching physics, because it's such a storehouse of things that are wrong. And it's great because you grow up thinking these things, and suddenly you say, wow, that's wrong. And then you remember it. You'd never remember it if it's just written on the blackboard.
Mm-hmm.
So have either of you convinced the other one that he was wrong about something?
I don't think we've really tried it.
I mean,
because we're in different fields, and so.
No, but I think
Politics, religion,
well,
strategy.
We first met by me. I think you've told that story about the first time we met. I argued that Richard was wrong about something, and now
did you convince him?
No, I think we've come to a mutual. I like to think we both moved a little bit in the direction.
I've actually just been writing about that in my autobiography.
I can't wait to read it.
And I said
we'll see
something
if the story
like,
is the same as the way Lawrence tells it.
I said something like, a man stood up in the audience, not particularly tall, but every inch a confident one, or something like that. And I was bowled over by Lawrence's fluency, and this was unusual coming from an audience question. And then we had a drink afterwards. I mean, he was criticizing me for being too aggressive towards religious people,
because it wasn't nice, or it wasn't strategic, or
not strategically, not politic, because you don't convince people by telling they're idiots, and that of course is true. Although I myself.
In the movie we talked
have
about
been convinced by being told I was an idiot.
And I argued strategically, I've always said teaching is seduction. You've got to go to where people are and try. But, at the same time, having said that, you get woken up. And so I think it's 1,000 points of light. It takes all different approaches. And sometimes kicking, someone in the head is the only approach you can have. And I think so there are many times, the greatest example I can think of where Richard sort of convinced me I was an idiot, in the sense he wasn't talking to me necessarily, but I was in the audience. And I suddenly thought, oh yeah, I bought that garbage all along. It's a wonderful example of yours about that newspaper. I've told you about it, where there's at Christmas time, there's a picture of these kids, and it's like these little kids, and they're all happily playing together. And it's like, they say, this is a Muslim kid, this is a Jewish kid, this is a Christian kid, this is a Buddhist kid, and you go, oh, isn't that sweet? And then you think, what the heck? What if we said this is a neoliberal kid? This is a socialist kid. I mean, these are 3 or 4 year old kids. How dare we label them? And it never hit me. And
that didn't hit me either. As I was listening, I was like, what's the
that's
catch
one
gonna
of my
be?
main. I mean, I use the phrase consciousness raising because which is a feminist phrase, and feminists have raised our consciousness about things like one man, one vote. And I think that we are in the business of consciousness raising. We're not trying to dictate to people what they should do, but something like saying, this 4-year-old child is a postmodernist child. This 4-year-old child is a neo-Gramscian Marxist child. You just don't do that, and yet we all don't bat an eyelid when people talk about a Catholic child or a Protestant child or a Muslim child. And you have no more right to call them a Catholic child or a Muslim child than you have to call them an existentialist child.
So that
I want to meet that child.
But that's a great example of sort of, he wasn't trying to seduce me. He was trying to, or me, the audience he was talking to me. He's pointing an example of, again, confronting your own misconceptions, and then you suddenly realize how silly they are. And so sometimes I think it takes what may seem harsh, although I was again saying to a reporter today, Richard gets I think I was presuming more about the Richard's approach to things because I bought into the claim that he was strident. But having spent a lot of time, and also now having been called strident myself, I see that it's not particularly strident. It's this rap you get. And in our society, the minute you question, I said it in the movie, I think, the minute you just begin to ask questions, but if you ask questions about anything else, you're admired. But the minute you ask questions about religion or God, you're called strident.
And you're shoving things down other people's throats.
Yeah, it's that wonderful quote of Ricky Gervais where it says, keep quiet about your atheism, and it's at the end of the movie. It's like everyone has a right to think what they want, but keep quiet about your atheism. Yeah. Anyway.
Do you think, never mind about religion, do you think that there's something threatening about clarity? I think there are some people who somehow feel warm and cozy if they get a lot of obscurantist sort of twaddle. But in a way, that was the problem with, I said when you stood up in the audience, and it was the fluent clarity of it, which came across as being aggressive, and it probably wasn't aggressive.
Oh, that's interesting.
And actually, Neil deGrasse Tyson attacked me in similar terms in the identical place in San Diego. Actually,
in San Diego.
In the same.
Actually, when I criticized you earlier, San Diego, we already discussed it. But that's
was that right?
Yeah.
Where was the first time then?
It was actually at an event near
Canada?
Buffalo at that dedication. For the
I must get that right.
Great example of showing Richard he's wrong and having him.
But Neil
trivial things.
Neil Tyson. I just had an argument with Joan Roughgarden.
Yeah.
Who'd become religious or become rather vocally religious, and I'd had an argument with her, and Neil Tyson stood up and said something about the fierce clarity of what I was saying was cruel or something like. You forget his exact words. It's quite a popular thing on YouTube. If you Google YouTube Tyson Dawkins, you get it. And he was really.
All your interactions.
But, I mean, the interesting thing is that his intervention was about as clear and fluent as anything I've ever heard, and so. But I mean, that which is interesting in itself. And that was the time when I said I gratefully accept the rebuke, and then told the story about science is interesting, but if you don't agree, you can fuck off.
I guess there's a reason that governments are infamous for using obscurantist language to talk about their policies or their views. It's so much gentler and more sinister.
Well, I mean, it is amazing to listen to a conversation where people are the purpose is to diffuse and to obfuscate, and politics is largely that. And it's unfortunately I don't see a big difference between ideology and religion. I don't. Ideology produces violence too. And ideology is basically the idea, like religion, that you know the answer before you ask the question, and that you know what's right before you even discuss it. And once you know what's right, the purpose then what you do in any discussion is try and twist things around to that. And the same thing we both debate with theologians and others. And it's just amusing to see the epicycles with an episode. I mean, I'm not talking about the really ridiculous ones like some of the ones you saw in the movie. There are some quote unquote refined theologians who are and they're very bright. Not like the Archbishop of Sydney, who's a moron, but they're.
But how do you really feel, Lawrence?
Yeah, well, you just have to watch them. But these guys are very bright, and what they're bright at is producing these incredibly complex arguments to get to nonsense.
Yes,
and it's really amazing.
So, have either of you? Do you feel like you've learned anything about how to persuade people? I mean, I imagine it's rare to actually change someone's mind about religion, but I know it happens sometimes.
Well, I'm pleased to say, I know I've been many times with Richard where people come up and say, the God delusion changed my mind, and I'm happy, and to some that happens to me too. It's really gratifying not to know that you've changed your mind, that you've had an impact on someone in a positive way, but I think it happens, and it happens a lot. And the same thing happens. One of the interactions, the nicest things about this movie is people have come up or written and said, I've learned that that there are a lot of people who feel this way, and I'm not a bad person, in spite of the fact of what my neighbors or my parents or whatever tell me. And so I think it is possible to change people's minds. That's not what we do, as we were saying to that journalist. It's not what we do when we debate. We're not trying to change. Richard wasn't trying to change the mind of that archbishop, but presumably what he was trying to do was the audience members who may not be so entrenched, get them thinking about it, right?
That's right. There's a third party listening in, yeah.
But is it the presentation of your arguments, or is it showing people that atheists, don't actually eat babies, or is it mocking?
It's both of those. I mean, we've got my American foundation is running a campaign called Openly Secular, part of which is to try to get a whole lot of people, a bit like the cameos in the film in The Unbelievers, getting people to make just sort of 1-minute YouTube films saying, I'm an ordinary person, I'm a bus driver, I'm a waiter, I'm a crossing sweeper, I'm a lawyer, and I'm an atheist. And just because in America the popular perception is atheists have two horns and a tail, and so
we talk about in the movie. I mean,
yes.
It's that this amazing studies that show that atheists are distrusted more than any other group other than rapists.
Except rapists.
Yeah.
Right.
But also you need argument, you need rationality. But I want to pursue the thing about clarity, because I'm interested in this. When you're in an audience, when you have somebody asking a question from an audience, and most people are quite hesitant and quite nervous, and so there's a fair bit of sort of stammering and stuttering and repetition and things. If somebody stands up from the back and in a loud, clear voice, declaiming total clarity, fluency, as though he's reading it, he's not reading it, but it's as though it's sort of coming straight out of his head, there's something a little bit threatening about that clarity, and there shouldn't be. But am I completely wrong about that?
It's interesting. Well, I
mean, one sort of look.
Well, I think
who the hell does he think he is? It's a sort of.
It's interesting. I guess I think we are trained with these social mores that you're not supposed to be too honest. That you're supposed to be. That even if you think someone's being an idiot, you don't necessarily say it all the time, and sometimes you do. But or disagree or you don't want to embarrass people. I think, and so I think there's these social arguments for why in common, in a lecture that I think it's appropriate, but in a dinner party you probably wouldn't. I don't know. Have you done it at dinner parties?
That's right. You at a dinner party you wouldn't wish to come across as being too
or embarrass your host or someone else.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a social thing.
Yeah, I think if you look at the way people higher in a social hierarchy traditionally talk to people lower in a social hierarchy, it's much more simple and direct, but the way you talk up to someone above you is with lots of flowery language and Phillips and honorifics, and that's sort of how you show respect.
Yeah.
So there might be some echoes of that.
Yes, I think
as
so.
well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Fun mystery.
Yeah.
Let's change tacks a little bit. I keep thinking about what are the hurdles to not even science literacy, but science appreciation and general positive feeling towards science. I was actually going to give my own answer, but I'll stop myself first.
We'll hear you for a change. Okay.
So I don't think this is the main one, but one thing that I've been wondering if it plays a role is the fact that there's this distinction between really established science, like gravity and evolution, and then science referring to new papers that are published, each week in various scientific journals. And I don't know if this is true of physics, but for at least most scientific fields, there's just a significant minority and maybe even a majority of papers are wrong in some way, and they fail to replicate if anyone even tries to replicate them. And so you can, quote a nutrition study about how coffee is good for you, and then the next week it turns out that's wrong. And so I wonder how much of people's distrust of science is just, not making that distinction between.
I think you're right that people don't realize at the forefront of science, there's a lot of speculation and there's a lot of garbage. But the neat thing is that there's a process for filtering that out, and that's what we don't teach. We teach a set of facts, and I think a lot of the problem goes to journalists actually, because they love to report this study, and then they don't explain. Then when another study contradicts it, they don't ever go back and say, now look, we've tested this idea. So this week this is true, that week that's true, and it's never. And that, I think, I agree with you, is a real problem, because people get the idea that there's no constancy, that everything we think today will be proved to be wrong tomorrow. But the important thing is that it can be proved to be wrong.
Yeah.
That there is a process.
But I think Julia's right that there's a distinction between, say, big physics, where when something's wrong, you know that somebody's going to repeat the experiment, and if somebody says that there are particles traveling faster than light, then dozens of physicists all over the world are going to be beavering away testing that. But in medical science and nutritional science, as you say, there's just so much complexity going on, so many different studies going on, so many variables influencing the point of interest, that it's hardly surprising that you get contradictory results, and there's just too many of them to replicate. People aren't going to... I mean, many of the studies in my own field of animal behavior, you pretty much know nobody's ever going to repeat the experiment. It's just there are so many experiments you could be doing, so many different animals, so many different things. The really controversial results get repeated.
Yeah, that's the point. If it's interesting enough to be significant, there's a lot of garbage you won't repeat, because you, as Feynman used to say, again, I have a certain amount of time, and so I'm not going. When I've used to debate UFO people, right, and they'd always say, do you know about this episode in 1946 where so and so, and if you haven't studied that, how can you say? Yeah. And you say, well, look, I have a certain amount of time, and given the likelihood that it's right, I'd rather spend my time on other things.
That's right.
But the controversial stuff, I think, does get addressed, and gets addressed relatively quickly. But even then, it may take time. But you hit your point. I think the medicine and biology are just much. That's the reason I do physics. It's just much easier. It's much easier to do experiments.
It's
but
noisy.
It's the hard science. I don't.
But it's the hard. I don't know why they call it the hard science, but it literally is easy in the sense that it's easier to define things. It's easier to get rid of the variables that aren't relevant. Whereas in human studies or medical studies, and you can have 10 trillion collisions at the Large Hadron Collider. But if you're doing an epidemiological study, a large sample might be 3 people, because it's hard to do experiments on people. That means you should be, by the way, much more suspicious. And so we should learn that when we come out with these medical studies, you should ask, how many people are involved? What were that? So I think the example should be that we should be skeptical. And that's a great thing to be.
In experimental physics, predictions are verified to a very large number of significant figures, and if they're not, you're unhappy. In biology, you plot a kind of scatter plot, and you have dots on it, and you're happy if there's a sort of vague upward trend.
There aren't. I mean, that's a problem. I mean, my biologist friends of mine tell me that, and I don't know if you agree, but that the problem is in biology, things are often not generalizable. They're very specific to organisms or individuals within a species, and so it's very difficult to make general theorems.
Right.
And maybe it will be impossible, but physics you can.
And the nutritional things you're talking about, whether coffee is good for you or bad for you, whatever it is, if the relationship between whatever it is, the dosage of the substance, whatever it is, and whether it's good for you, if it's U-shaped or S-shaped, then you're only studying a small part of the curve, very likely, and so it's good for you up to this point, and then at the top of the curve it goes down again, it's bad for you. And the true relationship may be much more complicated than that even.
But there's also, by the way, a big problem, I think, that, and it's not, I blame journalists, but scientists are also to blame in this sense, that in the climate where funding is limited, and universities are aware of this, you tend to see science done by press release far too often. And universities want to immediately do press releases for every result. And there are reasons, but one of the reasons is to gain profile and in some sense influence funding. And so it is. I see it happen far too often nowadays. I don't think it was always done that way. I think it's recent, probably because of the ability to actually put something on the web. So I think that we tend to too often announce results by press release well before they've been studied or peer-reviewed. And so when almost everything I read, I think that's probably garbage. And especially, and we have to teach people this. If it sounds stupid or ridiculous, in particular, my mantra is I learned from the publisher of the New York Times, who said, I'd like to keep an open mind, but not so open that my brains fall out. And so you ask yourself when you read that, if I'm going to believe that, do my brains have to fall out? And if they do, then it's probably wrong. And it's that simple. There's nothing profound about it.
Yeah.
It contradicts everything I know, so I should be skeptical about it.
There are studies showing the numbers of citations of scientific papers, and it's terribly skewed. There are a few scientific papers which are massively cited by lots of other people. The great majority of scientific papers are never, ever cited, and probably never, ever read.
Yeah, most of the stuff is exactly. It goes in the dustbin of history. But that's another great thing, because the way you do science is having an idea that actually has an impact on others. It's not just, if you claim it, it's one thing, but when other people find it interesting to test that idea, then it's important. And there are some really good examples in physics, I don't know if there are in biology, of actually one of the most cited papers in physics by Steve Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize for it later, had one citation for the first 10 years.
Yeah.
It was not because things hadn't caught up with it.
Too far ahead of its time.
In a way, yeah. And so it's neat to see that the discipline can eventually find the gems in the coal,
As a depressing capper to that thread, one of the most controversial papers in psychology in the last few years was Darrell Bem's paper purporting to show evidence for psychic powers. This was published in the top psychology journal, and a group of other researchers did a replication of it, and it failed to replicate, and they brought that to the journal, and the journal said, we don't publish replications.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. It says something about psychology, doesn't it?
I'm not going to applaud that.
Not a lot of psychologists in the audience, I see. So do you have any advice for people for how to distinguish the science they can, confidently quote from the science they can't, or is it just...
Well, I tried to say, first ask yourself, does it seem reasonable? Now, look, it just because it doesn't seem reasonable doesn't mean it's true, but it's a good first pass. Mm-hmm. And don't believe what you read. It's what everyone tells, it's not just science. Historians, any teacher should be teaching kids to be skeptical and be critical of what they read. And then ask yourself, is it logical? And is there evidence against it? And those are guidances for life, and that's what... I don't think we should see science because of the facts of it. I mean, I love the facts of the universe. I like to get people excited about it. But in school, most people aren't going to become scientists. Right. What they really need to learn are those techniques.
Right.
Is it something I desperately want to believe?
Yeah.
Then be skeptical about it.
And is the person who's saying it got a vested interest in it? And that's always amazes me, that people, when politicians give remarks, and you ask, when a senator from a coal state in my country says, global warming isn't real. You got to ask yourself, well, let's see, what interest do they have in making that statement? And no one, and even journalists aren't open and saying, well, this guy is, or many journalists, they say, maybe he's got a reason and a vested interest for doing that. We shouldn't listen to him.
There's the rules of politeness and niceties getting in the way of clarity
again.
Well,
journalists should not be nice. No, I think there's a huge problem of journalism. Well, but there's a problem with it. Anyway. If you're not nice, then you don't get invited to the White House press briefings. And so there's this, and Noam Chomsky's talked about this a lot. If you don't play along, then you don't have access.
Right.
And so there's this real issue.
Very narrow path to walk, I don't know if I mentioned this to you guys, but we have a surprise video guest who wanted to make a comment for you to respond to. You know Rebecca Goldstein?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Just with her.
Maybe the video people can start
putting
the projection
up there.
Just to introduce her, she's a novelist and philosopher. She did her PhD in philosophy, and she's written a bunch of books on Gödel and Spinoza, Plato, and she won the MacArthur Genius Grant, which is a prestigious award to young researchers. So I told her about this debate, and she wanted to comment remotely and see what you guys have to say.
Everyone keeps calling it a debate. It's a discussion.
Oh, I was complaining about that earlier, and then I
Yeah,
did it myself.
okay.
All right, Rebecca, over to you.
Hi, Richard. Hi, Lawrence. So I think one of the reasons that scientists often regard philosophers as, well, ridiculous is that they view philosophers as trying to do the same thing that they're doing, that scientists are doing, as being in competition with scientists. And, quite frankly, if that's what philosophers are up to, then they're ridiculous. I'm going to propose a different alternative, and I'd love to get your reaction to it. And this view of philosophy is very influenced by the views of a 20th century American philosopher, Wilfrid Sellars. Sellars proposes a view of philosophy as a kind of mediator between what he calls the scientific image of man, which is, of course, always progressing, and these core intuitions that we have, that we bring to bear in trying to make sense of the world. And some of them, frankly, clash with the scientific image. They have to be corrected in the light of the scientific image, or maybe they do, maybe they don't. So, for example, our view of time is flowing. Does it need to be corrected in the light of relativity theory? Our views about free will, do they have to be corrected in the light of the scientific image and what it has to say about our choices? I like this view very, very much because it shows science and philosophers joined at the hip and joined together in the project of reason. So enjoy your conference, and bye-bye.
So I invited her to submit a question because I know, I think both of you, but especially Lawrence, have clashed with philosophers over what role philosophy has to play in our search for knowledge and truth.
I think she said what I said, but she didn't. She said it more politely. That philosophy doesn't have a role in. If I interpreted what she said right, and it was hard to hear everything there, that philosophers can reflect on what scientists discover, but the discoveries are not up to the philosophers, and that's not a pejorative thing. It's a fact and it depends on the field. In physics, philosophy has no place whatsoever. I mean, in the said professional philosophers, it's not as if we don't. People say, "But I'm doing philosophy. I'm asking philosophical questions." Yeah, but the questions in physics have moved so far beyond the kind of early questions that philosophers asked that physicists don't read philosophers. They can't spell philosophy, but there are other areas of human activity where we don't know things so well, like consciousness, and philosophers have a much more important role to play because they can frame questions. But the answer is ultimately determined by the scientific method, not by pure thought or philosophical reflection. I don't know.
I'm trying to think of I do get something out of reading philosophy papers sometimes, and I'm trying to think what would be the best examples I can think of. Something like the sort of brain in a vat thought experiments, where you imagine something that's not actually possible to do, but nevertheless, if you download every single bit of your brain, or indeed your body, into a different person by some futuristic science fiction teleportation system. So at some point in time, a twin of me is created who is exactly the same in every atom, and presumably has exactly the same memories, the same thoughts, the same desires as I have. At the moment of his creation, we are the same person, but then we start diverging because we're no longer in the same place. We go into different places. We then, that's philosophically interesting. It's paradoxical. It makes you think, what is the nature of personal identity? Similarly, when a split brain patient, and this is where some real science comes in, a split brain person where you can show that the side of the brain that controls speech, says something different and sees something different and understands something different from the other side of the brain, which can only communicate by pointing, for example. And so you have a contradiction between what the left brain and what the right brain knows. Well, if, say, the left brain votes Conservative and the right brain votes Labour, or the left brain is religious and the right brain is an atheist, or if the left brain has criminal tendencies and the right brain is very law-abiding, does this raise problems about personal identity? Does it raise problems about justice? Can you sentence this person for a crime when only half the brain did it? And the split brain is a particularly extreme example. But then you could say, well, multiple personality syndrome, where there appears to be this is again importing some science into it. You wake up one morning and you're a different person from what you were the previous morning. Can you attach concepts like blame? I think this is a place where philosophical reasoning is something we all need to do. I'm not sure that professional philosophers who've read Aristotle and Hume and Locke are much better qualified to do that. I suppose in a sense they are, because they know what mistakes have been made, what have been suggested in the past.
Well, yeah, I mean, the virtue of teaching philosophy is to teach people how to carefully look at reason arguments and analyze them and look for logical flaws and such. But everything you said is really, in some sense, reflecting the virtue of philosophy is to reflect on the knowledge that empirical investigation deals with. Even the Gedunken experiment that you talked about at the beginning, about imagining this, and then the minute, that's okay, that's pure imagination, but then you say the minute they're in different bodies, they have different access to stimuli, and then you say, well, that idea comes from looking at identical twins, and so you're basing your investigation always, it seems to me, on empirical data. But philosophy is good at maybe framing some of those questions. But the question is it's not the question of is philosophy useful. We all do philosophy if you want to. But
so your question is, are philosophers useful?
Well, and the answer is clearly no. But
I was sitting here thinking, man, Lawrence has really changed his tune.
No, I had to say that. No, I mean, some of them are and some of them aren't. It's like any field. But I think those philosophers who think they're doing science, no, well, I'll get in trouble. But
has that ever stopped you before?
No,
Chris?
and I won't now. It's not a value judgment that scientists don't read the philosophy of science. Professional philosophers who do philosophy of science tend to talk to other professional philosophers who do philosophy of science, and has no impact whatsoever on the progress of science. Now, that doesn't mean it's not useful in some way for human investigation, but to make the presumption that it leads science is just empirically wrong, and that offends some people, but it's true.
All right,
okay.
Fair.
You agree? I mean, you have anyway. I don't know. I'll let
well,
you.
I've said my piece.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Now I want to introduce another guest questioner, Professor Herman Philipse, who is actually in the audience today. So hopefully one of our assistants can locate him. Professor Philipse.
He is located already.
Oh, excellent. So let me just give him a brief introduction. He's a professor at Utrecht University. Forgive my pronunciation. Oh, hi, everyone.
There they are. You mean there are people out there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, other people up there, too. Arguably, I think you could call him the Dutch Richard Dawkins. I've heard that term bandied about.
Good for him.
He's the writer of the Atheist Manifesto, as well as a bunch of other books, and most recently, God in the Age of Science, ? So if Professor Philipse is so inclined, we've been talking a lot about the interaction between science and philosophy. I know you have a lot of thoughts on those subjects, some of which might contradict those of our guests. If you'd like to ask a question, we'd appreciate it.
Yes, let me first express my delight to be in presence of Lawrence and Richard again. I greatly admire their writings, and I must confess that I agree with most of what they are saying, even what is said about philosophy just now. I think that since about the 1920s, no philosopher who is well in his wits will claim to do factual discoveries or so on. So what philosophers nowadays do is much more logical analysis of text and clarification of concepts and so on. And my question is related to this type of clarification. When I read both of the books, when they were published, so The God Illusion, delightful book, I can recommend it, and then The Universe from Nothing, which I recommend as well, I saw that there was one rule that you both applied, and that is the principle of simplicity, or what was mentioned in the beginning of this evening, that if we have a complex explanation and we have a more simple explanation, we should prefer the more simple one. And you both seem to accept that one. Now let me ask you very briefly a question about the so-called fine-tuning argument. We all know, physicists clearly discovered, that the constants of laws of nature have to be in quite a limited selection of all the possible values they have if life would be possible in our universe. And that's called fine-tuning, and it is a very complex topic. I will not go into the complexities. Now, there are three different explanations of fine-tuning. If you wonder, why is our universe fine-tuned for life, so that life is possible? There are three possible explanations. One is it's simply a matter of accident, completely accidental. Now, most physicists would probably react by saying, well, then it is very improbable. Another explanation is God designed the universe in such a way that life would be possible because he's good and he intended to do that. And then, of course, the likelihood of fine-tuning is very, very high, maybe even 1. And a third explanation says, well, let's suppose there is a multiverse. There are maybe infinitely many worlds, and of course we live in a world that is such that life is possible, otherwise we wouldn't be there. But there are infinitely many other worlds in which life would not be possible. And then, of course, the likelihood that life is possible in one of these worlds is also very high, maybe 1. Now, both of you prefer the multiverse hypothesis over the God hypothesis. But, of course, philosophers would say, well, the multiverse hypothesis is much more complex. It posits many more entities. So, according to your own rule, you should prefer the God hypothesis. What about that?
Well, you don't really believe that, do you?
Oh, of course not. But well, I want to know your answer.
I'll let Richard answer first, because I know what it's going to be, and it's going to be a good answer. And then I'll come up with something else. So go start.
First of all, our research group in Oxford used to have a thing which we called the Cambridge version of Occam's razor. And the Cambridge version of Occam's razor is never be satisfied with a simple explanation if a more complicated one is available. But I would absolutely dispute, and I'm sure Professor Philipson would as well, the suggestion that the God hypothesis is simple.
Yeah.
It is not simple.
It's not.
The multiverse hypothesis actually is rather simple. It's rather extravagant. It's wasteful in the sense that it postulates a very large number of universes. But the God hypothesis is a total non-starter because it postulates the very thing that it's trying to explain, which is something improbable. We're trying to explain the alleged fine-tuning of the universe, which, by the way, not all physicists accept. Some of them...
I'll elaborate on that.
You elaborate on that. But even if it's true that the universe is fine-tuned in the sense that perhaps the physical constants, half a dozen or so physical constants, if they were ever so slightly different, if any one of them was ever so slightly different, then we wouldn't have a universe like we have that's capable of generating us. The God hypothesis has got to postulate a being, an entity, which has the cognitive ability to know exactly how to twiddle those knobs of the physical constants in order to get them exactly right. And that's just as difficult a problem as simply saying, well, the knobs just come already twiddled. It doesn't solve the problem at all. And one of the things that Darwin is, we're way out of Darwin's depth now, and he's talking about biology, but one of the things that Darwin did for us is to raise our consciousness to the power of explaining things in terms of simple beginnings and development into complexity later. It would be very easy to imagine that the universe in which we lived was designed by some alien creature. We're all living in a simulation that was designed by some alien creature. But that alien creature would itself have to have evolved by some gradual, explicable process. You cannot get away with saying, I explain complexity by postulating other complexity. Now, there are theologians who say, oh, God is infinitely simple.
Yeah.
What utter nonsense. If God was infinitely simple, he wouldn't know how to fine-tune the universe, and he certainly wouldn't know how to listen to your prayers, forgive your sins, decide who to save from cancer and who not to save from cancer, and all the other things that he's supposed to do. But even if we just let him be a sort of deistic God, he wouldn't know how to fine-tune the universe unless he was already fine-tuned himself. That's a complete non-starter. The multiverse theory, it's disputable whether you'd call it complex. I don't think it's that complex. But it's got a kind of Darwinian feel to it, which I quite like.
Well, let me.
Yeah.
Okay, I knew Richard would hit that key point that God is not simple, but there's two major faults with your premise. First of all, it turns out the multiverse hypothesis is relatively simple, but you don't need it. And in fact, I just wrote a piece. It's in the New Yorker today, and that points out the big fallacy. What you said is, in my opinion, logically incorrect in the sense that you're assuming that those are the only three arguments. You're assuming the universe is fine-tuned for life. But more likely is that life is fine-tuned for the universe. This is exactly the problem that Darwin solved in the case of life on Earth. People thought the Earth was fine-tuned for life, and that's why there had to be a God. Everything was designed on Earth for man or beasts, and how could, everything was just set up, and God had created the Garden of Eden and all this stuff. But what Darwin showed was, no, life is fine-tuned for the conditions of the Earth, and natural selection fine-tunes different species to exist in the environments in which they live. So the fact that the constants of nature allow life to exist forget the multiverse. It's much more likely that life happens to exist in this universe because it can. And if it couldn't, it wouldn't. And it's so the life is, as we know it, is fine-tuned for the universe in which we live. But you also make the presumption that all life must be like the life we experience. And of course, that is also a closed-minded assumption. If the conditions and the constants of nature were very different, we do not know, but it's presumptuous in the extreme to assume that other forms of very different kind of life couldn't evolve in that circumstance. It's true that the conditions, the constants of our universe were vastly different. We couldn't evolve, but it's presumptuous to assume something else couldn't evolve. So the whole question is a red herring in my mind, and it makes the exact mistake in cosmology that people made about biology before Darwin. And I think what we're learning is that cosmology hopefully can have the same realizations that Darwin developed, which is that it's confusing cause and effect. So, anyway.
I think I'd be very happy to make that case for life, where we say this particular planet is suitable for life, and you could make it exactly the point you make. However, I suspect that Dr. Phillipson would come back, and I think rightly, and say, we're not just talking about life. According to some physicists, if the fundamental constants were different, if the gravitational constant was different, say, you wouldn't have stars. Well, so you wouldn't have chemistry. You wouldn't have
right. But Freeman. But how? So you wouldn't have stars. You wouldn't have chemistry. That you can't say that you wouldn't have a black cloud like Fred Hoyle. That wouldn't be intelligence. You could. I think it's really a limitation of the imagination to argue. And in fact, the point is, if I change the gravitational constant, then I could change a host of other things and still have complex...
Now that's a good point.
And so to change one thing and say, oh, if I change this, the world would be different. Well, why would you just change that one thing?
I agree.
So it could have been vastly different and still had stars.
We've got 6 knobs to twiddle, and we're only so far talking about twiddling them one at a time. And I suspect it could be right that if you twiddle them one at a time, you end up with a universe that not only couldn't produce life, but couldn't produce chemistry or matter.
But the interesting question is, I mean, it's right, but it's more than that. And I've had this debate with Freeman Dyson, who's a well-known physicist and friend, who's a very smart guy, about whether life can exist forever in the universe, and he said yes, and I said no, and I'm right, and he's wrong. But besides that, what he's very ingenious about is pointing out that you can imagine computation, which is essentially intelligence, existing in many different systems, and a black cloud was one example. You could embody in the motion of particles, of any kind of particles, you could embody in that a computational system. And so it's very myopic, which is what science tries to teach us not to be, to assume that life has to be organic, that life has to exist on stars, that you couldn't just have electron-positron pairs a trillion years from now that somehow embody a kind of consciousness. We don't know how, but not knowing how doesn't mean it can't happen.
Yeah, I think that, but I was going to go on to say that even if you limit yourself to the kind of life that we know with matter and things, twiddling more than one knob at a time.
And I've written papers showing that these claims about certain fine-tuned parameters are garbage. If you allow them to be more than one knob to be twiddled, you can show you can reproduce things exactly. And moreover, some of the apparent fine-tuning, I can imagine, and this is one of the ones that the religious guys use a lot. There's one parameter in the universe called the cosmological constant, the energy of empty space, which appears to be fine-tuned to 120 orders of magnitude. If it was larger, we wouldn't exist. And they say, well, that's evidence of design. But the point is, if it were 0, which from a physics perspective is much more natural, the universe would be a better place for life. So it's not fine. We can exist here, but it'd be better if it wasn't. So that apparent fine-tuning is also just garbage.
But the really important point is that whatever else it is, the God hypothesis is the worst of all.
Exactly, because it assumes more complexity. No, because it assumes more complexity. Absolutely. No, that's why I wanted you to give it first, because I knew it was the key.
There's a theologian, an Oxford theologian called Swinburne, who says on the one hand, God is infinitely simple because he's just one explanation for everything. On the other hand, you need God because if there wasn't God, every electron in the universe would behave differently. God has his fingers on every single electron, every single fundamental particle, making sure they all behave properly.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we're beating a dead horse, and which is a nice way of calling God. But the point, it seems to me, the key point is that God is an excuse for stopping thinking, ultimately. Because you say, look, I can't explain this, so I assume there's something I can't explain that created it all. And ultimately, it's the most extreme form of intellectual laziness I know of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, there were many, many things to like about that thread of the conversation, but I have to admit one of my favorite was the frequency of getting to hear Richard say twiddle. That was just very enjoyable.
Knob twiddling.
Yeah.
Knob twiddling, okay, good.
So I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. We have about 20 minutes left, and a bunch of you submitted questions before the program, and two of the organizers have gone through them and selected some of the questions that would be best to go through. So they're going to go through the audience and find you and invite you to ask your question.
Could we turn the lights up, though?
Yeah, please.
Okay, good. There we go.
Excellent. So do we have... Yes, we have someone ready to ask the first question.
Yeah, my name is Glenn. Let me first thank you for being here tonight. My question is a very simple one. Mainly aimed to Professor Dawkins. I want to ask him what's the most valuable piece of advice you would give a future biology teacher, and more generally speaking, what's the most valuable piece of advice the both of you would give to any future science teacher who's aspiring to make a change?
I hate the advice question.
Yeah, we were
I never know what to say. It's sort of come out implicitly in everything that we've been saying. Things like be skeptical, doubt your own convictions. But I suppose I would reiterate the point about never lose your sense of wonder, never lose your sense of what an extraordinary place we live in, what an extraordinary fact is the fact of our existence. And when you're doing science, you're rejoicing in that fact in a very tangible, intelligent way. You're not just lying back and saying, "Oh, isn't it all marvelous?" You're saying that, but then you're also dissecting it down and understanding where the marvelousness comes from. And that would be true of any science, although the details of how it would show itself would be different in biology from physics.
But
be honest, be persistent. I once went to a conference, a very posh conference in Germany, where it was a conference of mostly sort of Nobel Prize winners, but each Nobel Prize winner was allowed to take along one sort of young lieutenant, and I was young then, and I went along with Nikola Tinbergen. And among the Nobel Prize winners was Hans Krebs, and he was asked the advice question, and his answer seemed to me to be sort of too humble. He said, "If you want to get a Nobel Prize, go into the lab every day at 9 o'clock, go home at 5 p.m. and repeat for 40 years.
No, okay. But I think the question also had the aspect of a teacher, and I think that's and there it's a big challenge, and as my friend Steve Weinberg says, who's an atheist, he said, you're doing God's work, and really you're at the front lines. And I think the thing many teachers are afraid to do is show enthusiasm, is somehow explaining that why they are interested seems parochial. But in fact, that's what you have to do, it seems to me, if you're a teacher, is to never lose sight of the fact that it's okay to show why you are enthusiastic about something. And in fact, if you don't, you don't expect your students to be enthusiastic at all. I often tell teachers, and people have heard me say this, but nevertheless, it's the best advice I know. The biggest mistake any teacher makes is to assume your students are interested in what you have to say, because you've lost them. Okay?
You have another question? Somewhere? There we go.
Hello, my name is Stan. I think these days Catholic Church is losing its influence. Do you think that religion will die out, or at least practically die out, before humans go extinct?
Before what?
Before humans go extinct?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh. Start.
Well, there's a difference between hope and expectation, isn't there?
Yeah.
I think I gain encouragement from the shifting zeitgeist. It's not just a shifting moral zeitgeist, it's a shifting intellectual zeitgeist as well. The more educated countries, the more educated people, the less likely they are to be religious. Social welfare tends to undermine religion, for the Gregory Paul thing that Lawrence was talking about earlier. Looking at the world today, one has to be pessimistic about the Islamic world at present, but they're 500 years behind, whatever it is, and so 500 years sounds like an awful long time, and I don't think we'll be extinct in 500 years, although it's not impossible.
Yeah, I mean, all the evidence is that. As you point out, it's monotonically, not just the Catholic Church, every church in the advanced world, in the first world, attendance is going down monotonically, every single place. And so that says something. And you could imagine, if you were a scientist, you might extrapolate that curve and ask where it's going to hit zero. There are big, huge forces that are trying to stop that, I think, and it's going to be challenging. But as we said about the other issue, I think it's always, if you think about it, just one generation away. So the children are always the hope. And if we can ultimately educate children which is really the problem of the third world and in Islamic world. It's that they work very hard to make sure children aren't educated, and
or just read one book.
And women aren't educated, which is the real travesty, and so I think the hope is that if we can work very hard to bring education to children, then the rest is inevitable, I think.
I think it's Ayaan Hirsi Ali has made the rather pessimistic suggestion that we actually need to support Christianity. And I would quote Hilaire Belloc's couplet that goes, "Always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse."
Well, but
think about that.
But I don't know whether I agree with that so much. But I do think we should turn the whole world into the Church of England, and the reason is because it's so innocuous. That's been pointed out that in the United States, one of the reasons that such a religion is so successful is paradoxically the fact that there is enshrined a separation of church and state. At least it's supposed to be enshrined, and that, you'd think that would be a good thing to limit the power of religion. But what it did effectively in England, or any country which has a state church, the church gets lazy because they're guaranteed funds, they're guaranteed an existence, so they can be the Church of England, and everyone just smiles and doesn't listen. But in a country like the United States, where the churches have to be entrepreneurial. That's the word I was thinking about. They have to be entrepreneurial to exist. Entrepreneurship works, and they become really good at reaching out and at advertising and all the rest. So if we just had an entrenched church in the United States, then it'd be lazy, and you wouldn't need all these so successful churches. So it's an interesting paradoxical statement about the success of religion. I mean, it's interesting. You go to a Catholic country like Italy, and stores are open on the weekend, but in many places in the United States, it's a novel thing because it seems sacrilegious.
Great. Next question. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dirk. I have a short question. Do you think that Mohammed cartoons are helping the atheist case?
What did you say?
That what are helping the atheist case?
The Mohammed cartoons. The cartoons about Mohammed.
Oh, Muhammad cartoons are helping.
What was that?
Do you think that cartoons of Muhammad are helping the atheist case?
Yeah. Well, ultimately, in the long term, I think we have to encourage ridicule, because the more times we encourage ridicule, the less fearsome it'll seem, and by being afraid to ridicule something, we elevate it to a level that it shouldn't have. And no idea should be above ridicule. It's the best tool we have.
I think one of the most shocking things about not just this episode, but going back to the Salman Rushdie fatwa, is the way our kind of people, liberal intellectuals, have betrayed intellectualism, have betrayed liberalism by doling out this ridiculous respect. Respect for what? In the time of the Salman Rushdie thing, there were liberal intellectuals, bishops, and people falling over themselves to condemn this distinguished novelist for writing a novel. Somehow he brought it upon himself. He was asking for it. Same with the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. Freedom of speech is something that we really do need to fight for, and we need to come out into support. I don't particularly like the style of cartoon in Charlie Hebdo. That doesn't make the slightest difference. They should be free to do it. It's not the business of other people to, obviously not the business of the murderers. That goes without saying. But liberals who tacitly, I'm against the murders, but Charlie Hebdo people brought it upon themselves. That's a betrayal. That's a disgusting betrayal.
Well, it is. And I want to give a more modern example, which really depresses me, and related to Charlie Hebdo, which is one of the reasons I brought it out. So the New York Times, which is a paper I certainly write for every now and then, and I respect for in general, would not publish this picture. They had 3 articles about this picture, but they wouldn't publish it. This is, you know, it's a wonderful picture. It says, you know, everything's forgiven. You know, but they publish pictures of the terrorists in Paris shooting a police officer who was injured. Now, I find that much more offensive, personally. Now, the point is, should they not publish that because it offends me? No, because if you're offended, you own the problem. You own the problem if you're offended, and if it's a problem for you, the obligation for you is to speak out and try and explain why the person offending you is wrong. And so you should not be worried about people who are offended. It's their problem, and they have ample alternatives to try and overcome that. And so this disgusting idea that somehow, and I know the New York Times didn't do it, I'm afraid, unfortunately. They didn't not publish it because they were worried about offending Muslims. They didn't publish it because they were worried about violence. But if we stop doing what's necessary because we're worried about violence, then we've lost.
I like the remark of Christopher Hitchens said, "You're offended. I'm still waiting to hear your argument."
Exactly, yeah. And by the way, I will say that I'm drinking this in tribute to Christopher Hitchens, in case you're wondering why I'm having a whiskey.
It didn't seem like something that needed explanation, but I like the explanation nonetheless.
Well, I was just also, it's an experiment. I'm a physicist. He never seemed to lose his cogent rationality. I don't find that works.
He was a one-off.
Yeah.
But the other one, rather similar quote from Stephen Fry was, "You're offended? Well, so fucking what?"
Good.
All right, next question.
That's a good one.
Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Chris. My question is related to the previous one, but I'd like to give it a more positive twist. So, as the Charlie Hebdo attacks, they were like almost universally condemned. So do you think there's a chance that it actually might bring the religions more closely together instead of pulling them apart?
I didn't hear all of that.
So the Charlie Hebdo attacks were almost universally condemned. So is there a chance that this whole incident could bring religions together rather than pulling them apart?
Well, Richard made a good point to me today, which you maybe want to repeat, that some people are saying, well, you want to say it?
Well, first, I'm not sure why bringing religions together is particularly, I don't know what I mean.
No, I agree. Bringing religions together is kind of like the Lord of the Rings, where you bring all the dark forces together, and you don't want to do that.
But I think the point that it's not actually my point, but I made it to Lawrence today, is that the murderers, the thugs, might actually have been wanting to bring down universal condemnation and odium from the rest of the world, because they want Muslims to feel beleaguered and threatened, because they want Muslims to rise up and fight. And so it could be that we're playing into their hands, and who knows? I mean,
but I think, again, I think it's a great point. It hadn't occurred to me. On the other hand, it seems to me you can't worry about that. You just have to do what you believe in. And
yes.
And I ultimately think that well, you all know. I mean, this journal had this 50,000 person subscription rate, or sold 50,000, and this issue was 5 million. Seems to me that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing unless it has the effect unless that's what they were actually wanting.
Yeah, no, I agree. But then you hope that you could counter that by thinking about it. But you're right. It's hard for me to believe really that there's that level of strategic analysis. But it's hard to know.
Yeah.
Next question.
Good evening. To your left, hi. First of all, thank you for coming, and I hope this is the first of many visits to continental Europe. My question to you is, what kind of scientific discovery, if you can envision a scientific discovery that you think would tilt the balance of the public opinion away from religion and towards science and reason?
Did you get that?
What scientific discovery would tilt the balance?
Yeah.
Well, I can think of two. You can you can think a little more if you want, but because I speak without thinking. Richard thinks before speaking. That's the difference. But And both of them relate to the nature of the origin of life. I think, first of all, if we can demonstrate the natural mechanism by which non-life turned into life in the laboratory, that will be a significant development which will impact on this idea of the sanctity of life. The other one, it would be the discovery of intelligence elsewhere in the universe, which would, I think, which is a far more remote possibility. The first possibility, I think, will happen in the lifetime of most of the people in this room. I do think we're close enough to honing in on the origin of life, which is not what Darwin talked about, right? He talked about the origin of species. So I think that will happen, and it will have an amazing impact. It'll have the same impact, I think. Many of you are younger than me in this room, but you might remember the Catholic Church, which of course is always behind the times, was and still is against in vitro fertilization. You know, they're supposed to be pro-life, but they're against having a baby without having sex, which is amazing because they're against sex. But the interesting thing is the argument they used to give, if you read back in the old days, and we remember this, was that these kids would not have a soul. Because if they weren't the product of sex, they somehow wouldn't have a soul, because God wouldn't have intended it. Okay? And then, which is stupid, of course, but what's amazing and important is the minute the first baby was born, the first test tube baby was born, that argument just stopped, because it was obviously stupid. So you never hear that mentioned anymore. The church never talks about those kids not having a soul, because it would be ridiculous. So I kind of think that kind of evidence that it's so obvious that if we can develop it, that life develops from non-life by just natural, clear explanations, will go a long way. The discovery of alien intelligent life, I think, would be the other thing, because it would just demonstrate that many of our myopic notions are wrong.
Yes, the origin of life would be a fascinating thing to do. It always astonishes me that they pin so much faith in that, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, they clearly, having lost on evolution, they've now kind of retreated to the origin of life. But of course, it's totally illogical, so it never even occurred to me that was but it would be a very interesting thing. And I long for it to happen. I'd love to know how it started. The other thing, I suppose, would be something in artificial intelligence. If artificial intelligence is not progressing quite as fast as some people thought it would, but there will surely come a time when a computer program behaving like a human is so convincingly passes the Turing test, it can actually have philosophical arguments, can actually feel fear and love and amusement, laughter, appreciate paradoxes, all that sort of thing, and that you actually have a proper conversation like we're having a conversation. I think that would be terribly undermining, because has the computer got a soul? Does the soul go to heaven? You know, that kind of thing, the undermining of the alleged special nature of the human soul. In a way, it's already been undermined by Darwin. I mean, at what point in evolution does the soul arise? But somehow that hasn't hit home.
That's good. Good. Yeah, I agree. That would be really neat.
Great answer. We have time for one more question. So whoever's next in line.
It's got to be a really good one, though, right?
Yeah, no pressure or anything.
You're challenging me, but I'll try. My name is Kurt, and speaking of computer programs, in your early books, Dr. Dawkins, you are illustrating very nicely how you can illustrate how evolution works with computer programs. You have written some kind of computer simulations that actually illustrate very nicely how this evolution works. Now, my question is, why do you not write such a program to illustrate how religion will evolve and perhaps finally die?
It would be very nice to do something like that. I'm not quite sure what that would look like. Perhaps, it sounds from your question as though you've got some plans of your own or something. I'm not quite sure. I mean, if you were to, I thought you were going to ask, what further progress could be made in that sort of direction, and I would say then that my programs were limited to the very constrained ecology of a two-dimensional computer screen. And more modern programs actually have creatures moving around in a simulated three-dimensional space with a real simulated physics, where they don't bump into objects and they avoid each other, and they have a kind of reality in which they live and move and have their being. Now, religion, I'm not sure what it would mean to write a computer simulation of.
I think you'd
of
be
religion.
very. I mean, as a scientist, I'd be extremely skeptical of someone who claimed to do that, because religion is a very complex human notion. I mean, life, you can build a simple. You can only answer questions that you can answer, and we don't even understand the nature of consciousness. And people are trying to understand the evolutionary biology of why religions evolved, but all of this is knowledge that's just beginning, and it's such a complex question that I don't think you could. If anyone claimed to have a computer program that would talk about the evolution of religion, I would be very skeptical of it at this point, because we don't even understand, in the sense, what religion is or why it exists in a fundamental evolutionary perspective. It's a very high level concept, and I think we're way down here, right? Don't you think?
In one sense, I think we already have it in computer viruses, which are programs that spread through the silicosphere by the mere fact that that the code says "spread me" in one way or another, pass me on, copy me, etc. And they could evolve, and I think that's probably what religions are. I think they are a sort of computer virus which spreads because they contain within their own code the instructions for spreading. Believe in me and pass it on to your children. I mean, that's a powerful piece of computer virus code. Believe in me and go out and spread the word as a missionary. Believe in me and you will have everlasting life. These are all pieces of computer code that, when passed from brain to brain, have the capacity to make sure they're passed on again. And over the centuries, they've become pretty good at it, not surprisingly, because they've had a lot of time to evolve and perfect the techniques. If you leave this religion, you will be executed as an apostate, a fairly powerful piece of computer virus code, likely to get itself, if not passed on, likely to stick around once it has infected a brain. Difficult to cure this particular disease when it has a weapon like that at its disposal. So that's just kind of thinking aloud, but
it's neat thinking. I think religion as a virus is a great idea. But before can I just, this is peripheral, but before we end, and you might probably have some profound remarks then, but I just want to thank the people who put this together. I've done two things with this group of young people, and it's inspiring, and the fact that they could put 2,000 people together and do it so well. So I really want to thank them.
And I'd actually like to thank Julia for being a wonderful host.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. That's it. Let's please have a big rousing round of applause for our guests and all the wisdom they've brought today.